Hello citizens and welcome back. In today's video, I want to take a look at the murder hobo problem in Star Citizen, why it happened, and what can CAG do about it. Murder hobos are a problem in pretty much every game that allows combat, and different games handle it differently. Star Citizen is missing a lot of these mechanics and seeing a lot of these problems. But what can CAG do now and in the future to help? As always, if you like this video, sacrifice a like and a comment to the YouTube algorithm and subscribe for more. And here's a shout out to our amazing patrons and channel members for their support of the channel and everything else I do. First of all, I should define what I mean by murder hobo, especially in the context of Star Citizen. I believe the term originated in tabletop role-playing games, but it very much applies to video games as well. A murder hobo is a player that uses combat and violence as their main approach to solving problems. They will often attack players and NPCs instead of diplomacy or stealth or any other non-combat approach. They will ignore most of the narrative elements in favor of combat. They do this for no gain besides the personal pleasure from creating chaos. In Star Citizen, this would apply to people who randomly bomb outposts or ram you while you're landed or camp bunker entrances and take out people who come in for missions. Now, I know what about half of you are going to say, it's the PvPers, they're ruining the game. And that's the wrong way to look at it. Not every player who does PvP is a murder hobo, and actually not every murder hobo does PvP. Some of them just kill all the NPCs at a location and run away when a player shows up. So why is this a problem in Star Citizen? Well, simply put, there are no consequences to being a murder hobo. I mean, there is the crime stat system in lawful areas, but according to many players, the prison system is not an effective deterrent. We also have defenses and armistice zones around certain locations, but not every location has one or the other, and they are not always effective. An armistice zone also doesn't prevent ramming, and station armistice zones still allow the use of ship weapons. At the same time, measures like hard armistice zones limit player freedom, which is one of the main selling points of Star Citizen and many other MMOs. Now, how big of a problem is it? Well, depends on where you are and who you ask. In my observations, in Stanton this is pretty rare and limited to one location at a time. And generally it's difficult to discern between a murder hobo and a person shooting first and asking questions later because they are there to do something and don't want you to interfere. Then again, the latter usually try to communicate with you first. Now, in Pyro the situation is very different. Violence is much more common, and I saw many instances where someone would fly to an outpost, destroy all the parked ships, and fly away. For the most part, this can be expected, but there are no narrative reasons in the game for players to have a good reason to do this, but we will get to that in a moment. Now let me take a brief pause to fuel my caffeine dependency. Most of you watching are not subscribed, so go on and click that button. Also, don't forget to check out the latest episode of the Comm Relay podcast and my community apps The Hauler and the Armory. Now let's get back to the video. So, how do other games deal with murder hobos? There are a few ways, and not all of them are suitable for every kind of game, and we will get to how Star Citizen could do it in a moment. First, let's talk about the different methods of mitigating murder hobo behavior. And keep in mind that I'm trying to mention options that don't outright disable combat or PvP. The simplest and most obvious solution is the PvP flag, or the dreaded PvP toggle in Star Citizen. Now, the problem is that it doesn't actually fix or discourage being a murder hobo. It just makes it easier to avoid PvP, and that's not exactly what we want, given the open nature of Star Citizen and the plan being for PvP to be possible anywhere. Also, a PvP flag is very explicit, which might not fit into the immersive feeling of Star Citizen. A more immersive alternative are PvP zones. Essentially a structured area where PvP is allowed, but those have the same issues as a PvP flag. Now we could reverse this and create armistice zones where combat is not allowed at all, which is partially where we are right now in Star Citizen, which brings us to the same issues. So what other measures are there? Well, that brings us to crime, punishment, and reputation. If we can't disable combat or PvP, we have to introduce rules and consequences to breaking those rules. In other words, a legal system. In lawful areas, killing players or NPCs becomes a crime. If you commit that crime, you become wanted, which looks differently depending on the game. In Skyrim or ESO, that means you will have to pay a fine or a bounty will be placed on your head, which will cause guards to attack you. In Star Citizen, you can also go to prison to serve your sentence or work to shorten it. At the same time, if you commit crimes repeatedly, your reputation in that area goes down, which might result in settlements refusing service or guards attacking you right away. In some games, this even visibly displays for other players, which lets them know someone might be dangerous. In unlawful areas, things are a bit different, but we will get to that in a moment. We know that Star Citizen is planning to go this route, since we already have a very early version of a legal system, with crime stats, prison, bounties, and fines. But what's the point if it doesn't stop murder hobos at all? Well, at the same time, it doesn't limit the freedom of player actions, which is actually more important. So when you think about it, the actual goal is not to prevent players from being a murder hobo, it's about making being a murder hobo extremely difficult, which will discourage some players from becoming one. And with some luck, it will keep those who can't be discouraged away from other players who want to play the game. So how can Star Citizen expand its law and reputation system in order to achieve this goal? Well, actually in 4.0.1, CAG are testing an improvement that, while not directly related to reputation, might be pretty effective at keeping disruptive players away from outposts and space stations. CAG are significantly increasing the aiming speed of defensive turrets, which should be pretty interesting. We will see how it actually works out, but I think it gives us a little bit of deterrence for someone staying at a location and shooting at ships flying by or trying to land. But if the attacker destroys the defenses, the location becomes dangerous until the defenses respawn or someone repairs them, which could be an interesting mission for ground-based locations. It would also be nice if there was some warning on the star map when a location is under attack. At the same time, improving the defenses won't prevent a determined group of attackers from locking down the location, which according to CAG should be possible but difficult. You have to keep things believable. A random outpost in Pyro is probably not equipped to handle a Polaris showing up and destroying everything, but it should be more than capable of fending off a few fighters and maybe a gunship. And that's how we get to the next step. In real life, if you go somewhere and cause a disturbance, the police or security will show up and try to remove you. This part is missing in Star Citizen. We do have some degree of NPC response to threats, but it seems to have decreased in recent years. And this is actually another thing CAG can do to deter murder hobo behavior. They can significantly step up the NPC response to player disruptions, not just in the air but also on the ground. I am definitely looking forward to NPC improvements and seeing NPCs react more aggressively towards players who land at an outpost and start shooting. This is a problem especially in Pyro. CAG could possibly make use of spawn closets to spawn more and more NPC security to deal with the threat. And that brings us to reputation. Your reputation with different factions and even different settlements should impact how you're treated. Faction alignment would actually give meaning to coming in and destroying an outpost. But there would also have to be consequences to the perpetrator in terms of reputation and how they're treated based on that reputation. For example, if you have a bad reputation with a location, they might raise prices of goods they sell you. Same applies to repair and refuel. If you have a very bad reputation, they might start shooting as soon as you're in range. Let's look at a few examples. Let's say that you have a player in Stanton trying to cause some trouble. Let's say they decide to destroy some ships that are landed at an outpost. Since it's a monitored area, it will give them a crime stat and negatively impact their reputation with the faction that owns the outpost, the corporation that governs the area, and by extension the UEE. Having a crime stat prevents this player from landing in most locations in Stanton, but they can still retreat to Pyro or to Grimhex for fuel and repairs. Let's say that the player is a first-time offender. So when they eventually get caught or turn themselves in, they serve a short prison sentence. This removes their crime stat, but the negative reputation stays. This means that the affected factions might not allow the player to land or even approach their facilities. Think of this as the trespass warning you get around bunkers or the ATC refusing to give you a hangar. The player can change their ways and build reputation back until they are allowed to be in these areas again. However, if they choose to reoffend, their reputation will progressively get worse. And even if they are committing crimes in one part of Stanton, their reputation will eventually start getting worse everywhere else. For example, if the player is committing crimes around Hurston, the reports will eventually float up to the UEE advocacy, and they will distribute them to the other factions related to the UEE in the area. And having a worsening reputation would gradually have harsher consequences. For example, you would get scanned more often by patrols even if you don't have a crime stat, and eventually you would be barred from entering cities and stations or even fired upon immediately. This creates a separation between the short-term consequences of a crime, which is a crime stat, which can be removed and marks you as hostile to pretty much everyone, and the long-term consequences of multiple crimes, which is reputation, which gradually makes it more difficult for you to get equipment and fuel in some areas, which makes logistics difficult for you. And of course, increasingly harsh prison sentences every time you get caught. But in our Stanton example, you still have Grimhex as an area where you can reliably get everything you might need. But if the player chooses the path of a murder hobo, they might end up having a very bad reputation with everyone in Stanton and a neutral reputation with Grimhex. At which point they might be more trouble than they are worth, because even though Grimhex is a criminal hideout, they mostly want to go on about their business and don't want troublemakers. So at some point, even Grimhex might refuse a player with really bad reputation, which leaves them only one option: move to Pyro or another lawless system. And I think now is a good time to talk about lawless systems. I think that Pyro being called lawless is being misunderstood by some players. So let's break down the different types of control and oversight. We have lawful systems like Stanton or Terra, which are claimed and governed by an official government of some sort. So this would be the UEE or the Banu Protectorate or the Xi'an Empire. These governments have a set of laws, a legal system, and a police force or military to enforce it. In the UEE, this would be the advocacy or the navy. Obviously, in Stanton, we have corporate governments, but these are still a subset of the UEE legal system. So while they have their own rules and law enforcement, they still apply the UEE common law. So it would make sense that if you're a known criminal somewhere in the UEE, you will be a known criminal everywhere in the UEE. But your reputation with the local factions might be different. You might have a bad reputation with the factions in Terra, but you might be relatively unknown to factions in Stanton or Castra. Then we have lawless systems like Pyro or Nyx. In this case, lawless means there is no central authority and no defined law to be enforced. But there are still factions or a faction that lay claim to parts or the whole system, and they have some rules that they want to enforce. For example, don't kill members of our faction. So while these factions might be hostile to each other and they might have conflicts happening in the border areas, they will likely want to keep the peace in their core stations and facilities so they can maintain their supply chain. After all, if you're in a near constant conflict with another faction in the same system, you want your home front to be relatively calm so you don't have to pull troops and resources from the front lines. And finally, we have the unclaimed or frontier systems. These areas are either completely unpopulated or only have some very small outposts and homesteads. There is no central authority to govern or any major faction that lays claim to the system. The outposts might enforce some rules, but only in a limited area, possibly only in their direct surroundings. So this would be the true lawless area where no one will tell you what to do. But since you are in a remote and unpopulated area, you would be losing access to most creature comforts. Fuel, components, and gear would be rare, mostly crafted and low quality. And generally there will be few places to rest or respawn. So now that we have outlined that, let's have a look at our murder hobo in Pyro. Once they arrive to Pyro, they will find themselves with plenty of targets and also unlimited access to gear and logistics. Because in Pyro, nobody cares if the UEE doesn't like you, so our player finds the target and starts their rampage. And here it starts getting interesting. By attacking outposts and members of a certain faction, they might start gaining a positive reputation with the rival factions. And this might, in some cases, actually incentivize the player to start engaging with the narrative of the game and align themselves with one of the factions. And in theory, this would rehabilitate them into a normal outlaw player. They would still face hostility and logistics difficulties, but since they are aligned with one of the factions, they have a source of income and equipment, and they can still do their desired gameplay of attacking players and outposts. However, some players will choose violence and just attack anyone and anything they find. So they will eventually degrade their reputation so much that every faction in Pyro will be hostile to them. Now, this would mean a few things. First of all, every faction, outpost, or station would shoot the player right away. The player would be marked as hostile to all the members of that faction, and very likely the factions would put out bounties on the player. With no safe haven, this would make existence in Pyro unsustainable, so the player would have to move again, either to another lawless system and repeat the process, or to one of the frontier systems. And being in a frontier system, the player doesn't have a lot of options to sustain themselves. They can start crafting and building their outpost, or raid the existing player and NPC outposts for equipment and food. It would also lock the player out of access to pretty much everything. There would be few hangars to spawn ships, and no insurance company would deliver there. It would very much be an everyone for themselves kind of a situation, and existence and survival would be difficult, as was originally intended. You also have to remember that only players who want to live in these areas or murder hobos would find themselves in this situation, so I think it would be pretty interesting to watch. The point is that players who can't be bothered to engage in the narrative of the game and only want to disrupt the gameplay of other players would be confined away from everyone else and with each other. This obviously has some issues. First of all, most people get a crime stat by accident. Either you bump into a ship while landing, or you accidentally shoot a guard while clearing a bunker. For the extensive reputation system to work, this needs to be fixed. For ship accidents, I actually like what Elite Dangerous does. Every location imposes a speed limit. You can exceed it, but if you hit someone while doing so, you are charged with a crime. If you're under the speed limit, you have to pay a fine and that's it. I think this is a pretty elegant system. For accidentally shooting a guard, things are a bit complicated. I think this should result in a loss of payment and reputation with the issuing faction, rather than a crime stat. Additionally, I would have these missions generate an optional objective to revive the guards, which would lower the penalty for accidentally shooting one. With some calibration, this could probably fix the accidental crime stat problem. There is a general problem of detecting and flagging crimes in Star Citizen, and I think that's the big blocker on a wider reputation system as well. I wonder if CAG could use AI or a neural net to analyze game logs and identify crimes from that, even if retrospectively. The other, much bigger problem is that removing a player from locations with other players actually won't stop them from coming back and being disruptive. Nothing really stops the murder hobo from loading up their ship and gear in a frontier system at their base and flying all the way back to Stanton to wreak havoc. Technically, they should run out of fuel at some point on that journey, but nothing stops them from stealing fuel or another ship on the way. Also, some murder hobos are actually organized, so technically nothing stops them from bringing a starfarer to refuel on the way. But at that point, if you are organized as a group and have a base and you raid surrounding areas for resources, that makes you a raider rather than a murder hobo, and technically that would be valid gameplay. At the same time, many players that engage in this behavior have alt accounts that can serve as their logistics chain, which you can't really prevent. So is there any way you could restrict these players? Well, there are a few actually, but all of them are very non-immersive and restrictive. First of all, as I said a moment ago, living in the frontier system means that you have a limited access to a hangar or insurance. So if you lose your ship, that's it. But that potentially locks players out of ships they paid for, which is not great. But it might be the only real deterrent. You could also implement a sort of a customs check, meaning that once the player enters a system that is controlled by a faction, they get immediately stopped and scanned or attacked by a patrol. But I feel like that might break immersion. My final idea is imprint control. It would make sense that the UEE has some kind of a centralized database of all imprints. So if you're enough of a threat, they could seize your imprint, so that when you die, rather than respawning where you said your spawn, you are going to respawn in prison. But again, that is not very immersive, but I wonder if non-immersive means might be the only ones that are effective. In conclusion, Star Citizen has a murder hobo problem, and there is nothing CIG can do about it in the short term. They have to develop systems to address this and add spaces where these players can be moved, away from everyone else. And since reputation and improved law systems and NPC response are still very far away from being developed, this might become a critical issue for Star Citizen. It might even get to the point where murder hobos push out every other player group, which would be a problem, because actual murder hobos are actually a very small portion of the population. I believe that implementing reputation and the ability for players to become members of outlaw factions or create outlaw factions on their own would give people who would right now be branded as murder hobos a legitimate gameplay. At the same time, it would promote healthy PvP interactions in the form of faction warfare and bounty hunting. I would also like to point out that Captain Burks posted a great thread on this about Spectrum. It touches on a lot of things I talked about, and there is excellent discussion going on, so I will try to remember to link it in the description or the pinned comment. And with that being said, that's all for today. What do you think? Have you encountered the murder hobo? How did it go? How should Star Citizen deal with them? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, fly safe, and I will see you in the verse.